Hi, everyone. I am a 20-year-old Iranian-American climate activist, and I want to share with you all my story about why climate action is so important to me, how I was inspired to start my nonprofit Climate Cardinals, and what I'm now doing at the UN, and hopefully to share some learnings with you all about why it is that Gen Z cares so much about climate action and how we can have this intergenerational collaboration with business leaders supporting the next generation of leaders. So why did I become a climate activist? Both of my parents are from Iran, and I grew up every single summer visiting Iran to go and stay at my grandparents' house. And on one of my last summer visits, when I was 12 years old, I was struck by how awful the air pollution was. Specifically, you can see these headlines that air pollution in Iran was hospitalizing thousands of people over short periods of time. In just 24 hours, 1,500 people were hospitalized because of the air pollution. And I also learned that the Middle East was suffering on the front lines of a climate crisis. Specifically, the fact that in the Middle East, temperatures were rising more than twice the global average. And so when I realized this, I naturally wanted to talk to my relatives about the issue. And I decided to approach my aunts and uncles, and I brought them these statistics, and they greeted me with blank stares. And they told me that they had never heard of these terms: global warming, climate change, carbon dioxide emissions. It was all something completely foreign to them. And I started to look into why this might be, and I actually found a study that read only 5% of Iranian university students could properly explain the greenhouse gas effect. So there was a systemic lack of climate education in Iran, and when I went online to find resources to share with my relatives about climate change, I realized that on the UN web pages, on the web pages that I had frequented when I was trying to learn about climate change for my middle school classes, almost all of their information was only available in English, and there was almost no information available in Farsi, which is Iran's native language. Now, I wasn't going to let that stop me. I was a bratty and determined 12-year-old, and so I decided to work with my mom to translate climate resources into Farsi so that I could talk to my relatives about the issue of climate change. And I had never been happier to see fear plastered all over my relatives' faces, because translating the resources succeeded in convincing them that climate change was a real and pressing threat. And after that, I was really emboldened to realize the power that I was able to have as a young person, and also the influence that climate education could have on the world. And so what I started to do was I grew older, and in high school I decided to get involved with a variety of different nonprofit organizations and international movements. So specifically, you can see 0 Hour, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion. These are some of the largest nonprofits and movements in the world. And so throughout high school, I first got involved with this 0 Hour, and what made them special that it was almost all young women of color. And the reason this was particularly significant is because young women are actually disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, which is something that I learned, that around 80% of climate refugees are women, and also that people of color are being disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis because of factors like environmental racism. And so being able to learn about the climate crisis through this intersectional lens was one of the first steps in me becoming a more educated, more rounded climate activist that I've now taken into the learnings that I've applied with these other larger movements, which are Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. So Fridays for Future, I'm sure many people in Europe are very familiar, is Greta Thunberg's international movement that she kicked off. And so I continued that into the US, helping to organize nationwide strikes, and particularly in Washington, D.C., where I'm from, we were able to organize groups of school kids to strike every single week. And with Extinction Rebellion, that's actually how I first got my start in the climate world on a more international level. In 2019, I did a hunger strike on Capitol Hill, and it went viral. And so it was in the Washington Post, in the Guardian, and it was kind of my first view of seeing the power that social media and the power that news could have in terms of making people aware of the climate crisis, and also specifically the power of nonviolent civil disobedience to get the public and to get world leaders to take action. And now the youth movement has had a tremendous impact, and specifically in 2019, with Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, we were able to organize the first global climate strike. And so this strike actually resulted in over 4 million people in September going out into the streets and striking. And that was one of the first times ever that such a large mass of people had congregated together in an effort to get world leaders to care about the climate crisis. And it was after that that we saw numerous measures being taken, like cities and countries declaring climate emergency. And finally, climate was elevated to a status that it had never been. And part of the reason was because we've been starting to employ tactics that have been used in the civil rights era, in the women's suffrage movement, where when we get masses of people to go out into the streets to strike, it actually does get world leaders to pay attention. And this strike, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It really affirmed that the climate crisis is something that we cannot ignore. And so after I spent my high school years volunteering with these variety of grassroots organizations and nonprofits, that's when I got the idea to start my own nonprofit, Climate Cardinals. And so like I was telling you all, the reason why I first became a climate activist was because of the experiences that I had in Iran growing up, realizing that my relatives had a lack of access to climate resources available in Farsi. And so I continued to work with these different grassroots organizations. And something that really stuck out to me was that pretty much all of our advocacy and activism was only conducted in English. And so I couldn't help but think that we were leaving people like my relatives behind in our advocacy. And specifically, I realized that there was a need in the climate movement for people to be translating resources into languages other than English. So in my senior year of high school, I decided to start Climate Cardinals with the goal of creating an international youth-led nonprofit that could make climate education more accessible to people who didn't speak English. And so on the very first day we launched, like I was saying, I went viral for this hunger strike, and it taught me the importance of social media and news. And so on the very first day that we launched Climate Cardinals, we launched with a TikTok video that ended up going viral, and it reached hundreds of thousands of people, and over 1,000 people signed up to work with us on the very first day. And so what started out as me and my mom translating climate resources for my relatives when I was just 12 years old, slowly before my eyes started to grow, and now it's been 2 years, and Climate Cardinals has grown to over 9,000 student volunteers. This is a little outdated because we actually recently hit 9,000 student volunteers in over 40 countries, and we've translated hundreds of thousands of words of climate resources into over 100 different languages. And this has all been done on a volunteer basis, with the average age of our volunteer being just 16 years old. And it really affirmed to me the fact that if a ragtag group of teenagers that congregated just through the power of social media were able to do this work with almost no funding, imagine the impact that a concentrated effort by governments, policymakers, scientists, and specifically business leaders could have if they invested in the power of young people and understood the importance of sustainability. And that's led me to where I am today, where I work with the United Nations as a youth advisor to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So around 6 months after I started Climate Cardinals, I was invited to join the UN as the US representative and the youngest member on their first youth advisory group on climate change. And the reason I think that this is particularly significant is because it's the first time really on an international stage that the importance and credibility of young people was affirmed as leaders in the climate fight. And so if the UN and the Secretary General at the highest level can create this youth advisory group and really allow young people to have input into concrete decision-making, I think it shows that every single business leader, organization, institution has a responsibility to find a way to integrate the voices of young people into their decision-making. Because it is my generation that's going to be disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis if action isn't taken. We all are already facing the impacts of the climate crisis, but studies have already shown my generation, people my age, are experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis at a rate 3 times higher than our grandparents. And just yesterday, I was participating in a UNICEF briefing because they released this new landmark report that showed that heat waves across the world are leaving millions, if not billions, of children vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. And so I've been working for the past 2 years with the UN to make sure that young people's voices are integrated in decision-making processes. And I also had the experience to organize the first ever pre-COP Youth for Climate conference, where we brought together hundreds of young people from over 100 countries, and we were able to present proposals to ministers from over 40 countries, including John Kerry, to basically be able to concretely say, this is what young people care about, this is what our priorities are, and this is how you can support us in getting these initiatives passed. And the biggest thing that I now like to stress through my learnings at the UN, through my learnings with Climate Cardinals, is that the time is now to move people from apathy to action. I'm sure, or at least I hope, that many of you in this room think that climate change is a big deal. And that's the first step, and it's an important step. But I think where the disconnect happens is that so often I talk to people who tell me I think that climate change is a huge issue, but what is it that I can do about it? Or they acknowledge that it's a big issue, but then they don't take the steps to then further reflect on, well, what can I do? How can I play my part? And that, to me, is the next step that we need in the climate fight, is we need to look at how we can start to move people from apathy to action, in the sense that every single one of us has a way that we can play a role. For me, that was starting Climate Cardinals and trying to make climate education more accessible. For some of my friends, it takes the form of they're studying theater. Now they're looking at how can they make theater sets more sustainable. For my other friends, it's I'm studying computer science. How can I employ the knowledge that I'm learning to now model different climate simulations to see how we can build more resilient cities? And I think every single person here can assess and think, how can I in my workplace, how can I in my family, how can I make a difference when it comes to making the world a more just and sustainable place? And so hopefully as a collective, as a society, we can move towards action by helping people to also get over issues such as climate anxiety. We're beyond just not knowing how they can play a part. I think a lot of people feel very rightly scared by the fact that the climate crisis feels like this big looming issue, and it often feels like there isn't much that we can do about it. And I think that once we start to tell people that there is something, it's an incremental step. I didn't wake up one day, choose to be a climate activist, and then come here and speak with you all. It's been years in the making, and something that I first took my step where I translated these resources for my relatives, and then I started volunteering with these groups, then I started a nonprofit, then I started working with the UN. And so it was a series of steps of me realizing, how can I own my power and agency as a young person to make the world a better place, and to identify how I can make a difference. And I think very similarly for all of you, there's a chance for you to make that difference as well. And now I want to look specifically at some statistics that highlight how climate change is of increasing importance to Gen Z, and specifically that young adults are already altering their personal consumption habits to align with their values. So beyond, of course, the moral argument about why climate change is so important, there's also the fact that for businesses to actually engage the young consumer, there's a need to realize that consumption patterns are increasingly shifting, and young people do want more sustainable, secondhand, reduced plastic alternatives. And so these are some more statistics. 2/3 of young people are saying that climate should be a top priority. Another 2/3 of them have talked about the need for climate action on social media. And again, another third have personally taken action to address climate change within the next year. And I think you can tell from these statistics, there is a bit of virtue signaling where, although 2/3 of young people are saying that they believe that action is needed, only 1/3 of them personally have taken action. And so I think that, again, ties back to the importance of education and making people aware of, yes, if you think that this is an issue, there is a role that each of you can play in advancing a more just and sustainable society. And so we need to step up for Gen Z, and we need to stand up for sustainability. Again, 83% of Gen Zers are concerned about the planet's health. And like I was saying, there is this huge phenomenon now of eco-anxiety where young people feel paralyzed and they don't know what they can do to actually take the steps to address the climate crisis. And I do think a lot of the onus is on the older generation to realize that it wasn't young people that caused this situation. And so there's a need for intergenerational collaboration for the older generation to realize that responsibility, to step up, and to make sure that the future that we inherit is one that is actually livable. And now I want to end by saying, what do young people want to see? Like I was talking about earlier, that I kind of noted was that the importance of climate all really does boil down to the idea of systemic action. And so while there is a lot that you and I can do, it's also important to realize that 71% of industrial emissions were caused by just 100 companies. And so there's a need for climate policy and legislation to be passed. And so when we talk about individual action, I think it makes sense to look at it through that lens, because the number one thing that I always recommend to people is get engaged, get involved in political processes. So specifically, vote, get out the vote, make sure that we are actually getting elected officials into office who believe in passing progressive climate legislation. And so there's also a need on a climate education level for change to happen, so getting school boards to pass climate resolutions, getting climate education better integrated into the curriculum. This is a very big issue in the United States where I'm from, and I do think that education is the route to solving many of the issues that we do see in society, and specifically on the point of climate. And that's why after I joined the UN's Youth Advisory Group, shortly after I enrolled at Stanford, where I'm now a junior and I'm studying climate policy. And I do think that continuing to give young people access to education and resources, both in traditional schooling, but also using the internet and making things publicly available is so important. And specifically on the point of corporates and corporate action, I do think that making your resources publicly available, making it transparent, the steps that you're taking, is also going to be something crucial, because young people want to support businesses that have divested from fossil fuels, that have an emphasis on sustainability and circularity, and specifically that are approaching the climate crisis through an intersectional lens. And with the emergence of social media and news, it's easier now than ever for young people to cancel businesses and to see whether or not they're greenwashing. And so, again, while there is a moral obligation to talk about the climate crisis and to address this issue, because it is the most pressing issue facing humanity today, there's also a strong business incentive and a strong argument to be made that this is the future of consumerism. And lastly, I think we can all, in our own homes and with our peers, educate ourselves, each other, and to uplift marginalized voices. Like I was saying at the very beginning, the people who are going to suffer the most from the climate crisis are the ones who are living in developing nations, who are living on the front lines, and these tend to be low-income, elderly, children, women, and we need to make sure that we are protecting these vulnerable members of our society and creating a world that not just we want to live in, but we want future generations to live in. And I hope that you all take away from this that if I, as a 20-year-old, have been able to make this impact just purely because of the power of social media and the goodwill in my heart, then people who have real, tangible resources can uplift the voices of other young people and work together to create a society that is more just, more resilient, and one that we're proud to leave to future generations. Thank you.